Hello everyone, I'm Jackie from the Writing Center, and today we are going to be talking about text analysis papers. You may also hear these called things like critical reading, close reading, stuff like that. First of all, what is a text analysis paper? It is a paper that is based on the analysis of specific details in a text or multiple texts to support an argument. The most important words here are analysis and argument. Argument means your thesis statement, the claim that you're making about the text. And analysis is how you argue that and support it with evidence. A text analysis paper takes details from the text and has an argument about those details. The argument is not explicit in the text itself and is just one possible interpretation, but you want to argue your interpretation and persuade the reader to agree. A professor wants you to write a good text analysis paper because it shows that you are noticing things like patterns, themes, distinctive language, etc. in the text that you're reading. Being able to come up with an argument about the text shows that you are thinking critically about the class readings and discussions, forming your own thoughts and ideas, and that you can support your ideas with points and evidence. Your thesis statement comes at the end of the introduction and is a summary of what your paper is about and what you will spend the whole paper arguing. All other points and details should support the thesis and show why the thesis is true. If something doesn't do that, it doesn't need to be in the paper. It shouldn't be in the paper because the point of the paper is the argument that you're making about the text. Your argument, your thesis statement, should have a few things. First, it needs to be arguable. It's an opinion that is not explicit in the text itself. If it's arguable, someone should be able to argue against it. Someone might have a different opinion. Make sure that it is specific enough. If it is too broad or vague, you'll spend your entire essay on a weak argument and will probably struggle to find appropriate evidence from the text and connect it enough to your thesis. And those principles of it being arguable and specific very much go hand in hand. Lastly, it needs to answer the prompt that you were given because it is what you'll spend your entire paper on, so you want to make sure that you're responding to the assignment. So speaking of responding to the assignment, we're going to discuss some different types of prompts and how you can go about responding to them and what the thesis looks like in relation to these assignments. All of these are real prompts from intellectual foundations and English classes here at Carthage, so hopefully this will be helpful and representative of what you'll encounter in your classes. So this prompt says, in The Tempest, Shakespeare paints a world in which his audience is often confronted with the question of what is natural versus unnatural. In a formal argumentative paper and using evidence found in Shakespeare's The Tempest, answer the following questions. Is it human nature to become civilized, and what are the consequences of distancing ourselves from the natural world? For a direct question like this, you'll have to answer the question, and that will be a key part of your thesis. In this example, the prompt asks, is it human nature to become civilized? You essentially have to answer, yes, it is human nature to become civilized, or no, it isn't. So try to think about what you can do to make yours a bit original. What do you think a thesis for this prompt should look like? For an example thesis, we have, the text suggests that it is not human nature to be civilized, but an active choice, which people will not make if they take for granted that being separated from nature makes them civilized. This example is answering all of the prompt and is being very arguable and specific. It is saying, no, it's not human nature to be civilized, but it's not just saying that, it's giving more detail and describing what is true instead. Our prompts are going to get more vague as we go. This next one says, analyze the role of children in one or two stories from our readings. What does it mean to be a child in these stories? What does it mean to have a child in these stories or to not have a child? How do the authors in question play upon or attempt to overturn our expectations about children, about parenthood? How, if at all, does the author use a child's point of view to change, deepen, or confuse our experience of the story? Why is the voice of a child useful? So the first thing to do is identify the theme. The important part of this prompt is analyze the role of children. That is the part that's telling you what to do. Don't get spooked by all the questions. They are reflection questions to get you thinking about the theme, in this case, children. Definitely do not go down the list and answer every single question. We suggest picking a question to answer directly and considering which other questions you might indirectly touch on. And if you're concerned that your professor won't think your topic is comprehensive enough, talk to them and ask them for their thoughts on the thesis you came up with. For an example thesis, we have in the short story Good with Boys by Kristen Iskandrian, a child's point of view is necessary to understandably and sympathetically show the protagonist's emotional intensity and immaturity. This example uses questions from the prompt like, how does the author use a child's point of view, and why is the voice of a child useful? And maybe the paper will somewhat explore other questions, but some, especially what does it mean to have a child in these stories or not have a child? How does the author play upon our expectations about parenthood? Once questions like that seem like they're really not going to be relevant to this paper, and that's okay. This example definitely does analyze the role of children in a text from the class, which is what's important here. This is just one of many, many possible theses that could come out of this prompt. Next, we have create an argument about the conversations about race, slavery, and/or abolition you notice developing between at least two of the works we've studied this semester. Shared ideas you might consider include, perhaps obviously, those of personal freedom, justice, and the value of human life, but also some of the more abstract concerns that interest these authors, for example, notions of identity, sympathy, and nature. Think too about the rhetoric, style, and sound of the text you examine. This example is essentially the same as the last, but it takes a little more reflection from you because it doesn't ask you questions that you can directly answer. Especially if you're stuck or need some help reflecting, you can try crafting your own questions based on the prompt and topics that interest you. If you're not sure that you're on the right track, you can show your reflection questions or your thesis to your professor and get their feedback. For an example, we have themes of freedom, sympathy, and injustice arise repeatedly as a means to understand the problem with slavery, but abstract themes of freedom and sympathy fail to capture its horrors. We have an argument about the themes that were brought up in the prompt, and this is important. If you're writing about themes, you need to have an argument about those themes. What are they doing? Why are they important? How does this theme compare to other themes? Simply saying that they're there usually is not enough. That goes back to arguable, meaning that someone could argue against it. I don't think anyone could really argue that a lot of literature about slavery is going to include themes of freedom. But if you say abstract themes of freedom fail to capture the horrors of slavery, that is really arguable. Someone might, and probably a lot of people would, disagree with that. So we're going to be using this thesis as an example for future things and when we talk about how to do analysis. But for our last prompt, we have one that is entirely open-ended. It says, write a persuasive argument essay. The thesis must stem from and be proven by examples from at least 2 of the texts we have read in class. This is similar to the last one, except that the professor does not give you a theme. You might encounter a prompt that is on a particular text, but does not give you questions or a theme. While that narrows it down somewhat, it's still basically this because it does not tell you anything about what your thesis should be. So you can think about what themes and topics interest you. Some ways that you can do that are thinking back on a time when you had strong opinions in class, or by gathering quotes that interest you and looking for common themes. And similar to the last one, you can try writing your own prompts as questions that you'd like to answer about the text. So next, we're going to show an example of how to narrow down a thesis. And you can also use this as how to go from a vague theme to a specific and arguable thesis. So first we have, in different literary works that address slavery, there are many shared themes. So this is very vague and does not have an argument. We just have a vague idea of addressing shared themes in this paper. So getting a little more specific, next we have, in literature that addresses slavery, themes of freedom, sympathy, and injustice arise repeatedly. This is more specific in that it names some specific themes, but there's still no argument. Next, we have themes of freedom, sympathy, and injustice arise repeatedly as a means to understand slavery, but the theme of injustice is most effective. This is much better in that it is more specific and now contains an argument, but there is still some ambiguity. For example, what is meant by understand slavery or most effective. Finally, we have themes of freedom, sympathy, and injustice arise repeatedly as a means to understand the problem with slavery, but abstract themes of freedom and sympathy fail to capture its horrors. This is specific and arguable and tells us exactly what this paper is trying to improve. So the main lessons here are to make sure that your paper contains a specific argument and to look for any vague words or phrases where you could be more clear and specific. So next we're going to talk about how to support your thesis, which is where body paragraphs come in, and this is where text analysis happens. Because this is where you analyze the text, it's going to be most of your paper. The purpose of body paragraphs is to support your thesis by introducing evidence in support of your thesis, and then you analyze the evidence and show how it proves your thesis. Every body paragraph should have a topic sentence where you describe the point of that paragraph. It should have a quote, which is your evidence. Then the analysis shows the significance and meaning of your evidence, and then you simply argue your thesis outright and how that evidence supports it. And we're going to talk about each of these parts. The topic sentence describes the point of that paragraph, what you're going to talk about in that paragraph. It should argue your thesis and connect the idea of this subtopic to your thesis. Lastly, it sets up the evidence you're about to present. You want to give the reader an idea of how this evidence will fit into your argument. A great topic sentence primes the reader to see your evidence as supporting your thesis even before you've analyzed it, because it tells the reader what you're going to argue about that evidence, so when they see it, they're already thinking about your argument. So your topic sentence, your first sentence of your paragraph, describes what you're going to argue in that paragraph. Here we have an example. Remember our example thesis that we're using. Our topic sentence is, the freedom that Wordsworth imagines in his poem to Toussaint Louverture is not truly threatened by slavery and does not require human action. How are these connected? What is this student going to argue in this paragraph? Well, in their thesis, this student said that abstract ideas of freedom fail to capture the horrors of slavery. And here in this topic sentence, they're saying that this particular poem does not see freedom as truly threatened by slavery or requiring any human action to support it. So we can see that this paragraph is going to argue that this poem is an example of how the abstract theme of freedom doesn't really grapple with the horrors of slavery. We already know their argument and have that in mind when we see their textual evidence. So after the topic sentence, you introduce the argument, you introduce the evidence in the form of quotations to support your argument. These should be the evidence for both the smaller argument presented in the topic sentence of that paragraph and the thesis statement. You argue how that quote supports your argument of the paragraph, and then you argue how the argument of that paragraph supports your thesis once you get to the analysis part. Quotes are necessary in every body paragraph because they are how you show that the text says what you say it says. Even if your point is sort of a general principle of the book, you should still find a quote that shows that thing. And you can have more than one quote per paragraph. You can put them together if they show the same thing and then analyze both or all of them together, or you can have two where another quote builds off your previous analysis. You want to be careful, don't have too many. You don't want to have like 5 quotes in a paragraph, for example. And you can also have multiple paragraphs arguing essentially the same thing if you have quite a few pieces of evidence that you want to use. To incorporate the quotation into the paragraph, first include any necessary context or background information. This could include unfamiliar references, like in the example we're about to read, or describing where in the story the quote occurs. For example, here we have Toussaint Louverture was a crucial leader in the Haitian Revolution in which enslaved Black Haitians revolted against the French enslavers. At the time of the poem's composition, the war was ongoing and the French had imprisoned Louverture. Someone might not know who that is, and that's important context to be able to understand the quote. So that's good and important information to include, and before you get into the quote would be the best place for that. So then guide the reader into the quote with some kind of introductory phrase. Here we have, he tells Louverture, comma, as the guidon, and then wear rather in thy bonds a cheerful brow, as the actual quote from the text. And don't start the sentence right on the quote. It needs some kind of little introduction. So here are some different ways of incorporating a quote into your sentence. For example, in the first example, which we just read, the quote itself is a full sentence, and it's introduced by a short phrase describing it in a comma. In the second example, the quote, which is, hast left behind powers that will work for the air, earth, and skies, that's not a full sentence. It has no subject, so it is incorporated into a sentence that the student wrote. Wordsworth writes that Louverture, and then it goes into the quote with no comma. We have the same thing in example 3. Louverture, quote, has great allies and friends, which include man's unconquerable mind, end quote. But this quote has been edited. You can use brackets to edit the quote to make it more concise, add clarity, or make it work with the grammar of your sentence. So here, and which include were not parts of the original quote, but things that the student added to add clarity, to only include the parts that they wanted to focus on and make it all fit with normal grammar. And notice how in all of these examples you have the end quotation mark, the parentheses with the citation, and a period. So now we're getting into the analysis a little bit. After the quotation, restate it. In our example, the restatement is, he literally tells a formerly enslaved man to be happy to be in chains. It's fine and even good if the word choice shows your thoughts, but don't include other details or really argue anything just yet. Just restate it factually. In the example, the restatement is completely accurate and true, but the language shows what the writer is thinking about it, and we can kind of get a sense of where they might be going with this. So then explain why that is important. For our example, as Haiti had yet to win its independence from Napoleon, who was attempting to restore slavery, it is not difficult to see this as a message to Haiti in general. It displays an attitude that the current historical issues do not have the importance they seem, as freedom will continue to unfold despite current events. And finally, you have the argument. Just argue the thesis outright in terms of the body paragraph and the evidence you presented. The point is basically to say, here's how this topic proves my thesis. For our example, we have his dismissal of Louverture's personal loss of freedom and sanitization of slavery indicates Wordsworth's unwillingness to engage with the darker and more vicious elements of slavery. He glosses over the suffering caused by slavery and its perpetrators' moral deficits in favor of his purely abstract idea of freedom. The very last sentence of the paragraph should kind of provide a summary of the argument from that paragraph and very clearly and obviously support the thesis and kind of builds to that plain and clear argument that you want the reader to take away from that paragraph. So next we're going to look at a complete paragraph so you can see how all of these elements work together. The freedom that Wordsworth imagines in his poem To Toussaint Louverture is not truly threatened by slavery and does not require human action. Toussaint Louverture was a crucial leader in the Haitian Revolution, in which enslaved black Haitians revolted against the French enslavers. At the time of the poem's composition, the war was ongoing and the French had imprisoned Louverture. Wordsworth writes that Louverture has left behind powers that will work for thee, air, earth, and skies, and hast great allies and friends, which include man's unconquerable mind. Wordsworth presents freedom as a natural part of the world and human experience and suggests that it will continue to unfold organically after Louverture. The poem does not acknowledge the conscious actions to perpetuate slavery or the difficult work of defying the enslavers. The Haitian Revolution is only alluded to, and the poem glosses over the immense suffering that spurned it as well as the violence it caused. As he insists that freedom will naturally come about in the world and ignores the horrors of it and fighting against it, Wordsworth says to Louverture, wear rather in thy bonds a cheerful brow. He literally tells a formerly enslaved man to be happy to be in chains. As Haiti had yet to win its independence from Napoleon, who was attempting to restore slavery, it is not difficult to see this as a message to Haiti in general. It displays an attitude that the current historical issues do not have the importance they seem, as freedom will continue to unfold despite current events. His dismissal of Louverture's personal loss of freedom and sanitization of slavery indicates Wordsworth's unwillingness to engage with the darker and more vicious elements of slavery. He glosses over the suffering caused by slavery and its perpetrators' moral deficits in favor of his purely abstract idea of freedom. Does this seem different to you, seeing it all put together? Do you see how the elements work together to support the argument? It moves from the point to the evidence to explaining the evidence to the analysis. It kind of builds an argumentativeness throughout the paper or throughout the paragraph, and this is what we call flow. Hopefully you're also seeing that it's all about arguing the writer's point. And this is just the writer's opinion. Not everyone will agree with the writer's interpretation, and certainly many could read that poem and not get that. That is the entire point of all of this. So we're going to briefly talk about counter-argument paragraphs. A counter-argument paragraph is where you introduce an opposite opinion and attempt to disprove it. It's where you basically say, some people might argue the opposite of my thesis, but they're wrong and here's why. You want to be a little more respectful of that, but respectful than that, but that is the gist. Some professors require these. If you don't have to include one and you don't want to, you don't have to. And some papers lend themselves more to them than others, but any text analysis paper could have a counter-argument paragraph, because if you have a proper argument, someone could argue against it. They are structured the same as other body paragraphs in that they have the topic and argument, the evidence, and the analysis, but you have to explain the other viewpoint. And when you do that, explain the opposite opinion fairly and logically. Don't belittle it. Include some reasoning for why someone might think that, but then show why your thesis is a better way of looking at this topic. And the opposite viewpoint is going to be the opposite of your thesis, which is pretty easy to figure out if you're answering a direct question or arguing a negative. Arguing that something is not. For example, our example thesis argued that themes of freedom, sympathy, and injustice come up repeatedly, but abstract themes of freedom and sympathy don't capture the horrors of slavery. So the opposite argument would be that they do, and they are just as effective as themes of injustice. If you're not answering a yes or no question or arguing a negative, your counter argument paragraph might look a little different because your counter argument paragraph is going to be a negative. For example, if you're arguing that Odysseus is the most heroic character in the Odyssey, your counter argument paragraph would say, someone might argue that Odysseus is not the most heroic character in the Odyssey. And so in that case, you would kind of have to come up with maybe some other characters that someone else might think would be instead. For your quotes, there are different ways of going about it, but in most circumstances, the best and most straightforward thing to do is to have a quote that someone could use to support an opposite argument, and then explain and argue why it doesn't show that. The counter-argument paragraph is also a place to bring some balance to your thesis and maybe compromise a little. For example, the student with our example paper, after they argued that no, themes of freedom and sympathy are not as effective as the theme of injustice, could say something to the effect of, hey, I'm not saying that themes of freedom or sympathy aren't good and important, but they need to be accompanied by a theme of injustice to really capture how bad slavery was. It's a chance to acknowledge the other side and show that you can think about it, talk about it, maybe even incorporate some parts of it into your thinking, but still argue your thesis. To sum up the body paragraph and analysis, here are the parts we discussed again, this time phrased as questions. Sometimes that can be easier to help us wrap our brains around exactly what we're supposed to address. So you can think of a body paragraph in terms of, what am I arguing in this paragraph? What might the reader need to understand my evidence? What evidence from the text supports my argument? What does that evidence mean? Why is that evidence important? And how does that evidence prove my thesis? Finally, we're going to discuss how to set up and wind down your argument and analysis, which is what the introduction and conclusion are for. The introduction begins with a broad discussion of your topic, background info for your argument, essentially, narrows the theme until you introduce your specific topic and argument, and ends with your thesis statement. The conclusion begins with restating the thesis, summarizes key points of your paper, arguing the thesis throughout the whole time, and ends with a broad discussion of the argument's significance. What does it mean? Why is this important? Why does it matter that we see it this way? That sort of thing. Basically, you've spent your whole paper arguing your thesis. So what? The intro and conclusion don't need to be particularly long. They probably shouldn't be as long as most body paragraphs. If you have a lot of background info that you feel is important, or you really want to go into why your thesis matters, go for it, but they don't need to be long or complicated. Sometimes the intro and conclusion are represented visually with an hourglass, because the intro goes from broad to specific and the conclusion goes from specific to broad. And this stuff that we've been talking about what goes where and how to order things, is what you might hear called structure, and it helps make your argument as clear as possible, because the reader, things flow and the reader sees all the parts of your argument exactly where they expect to. So again, it helps make your argument really, really clear, which again is the point of all of this. So thank you for listening. In the Writing Center, we can help with things that we discussed here, like crafting or narrowing a thesis, strengthening argument and analysis, structure and organization, and much more. So if you would like individualized help with anything we've talked about today or any other writing concerns, please pay us a visit in the Writing Center. Thank you.